So, needle, thread, right. In recent weeks, we've been engaging and going over this turbulent moment in U.S. history in relation to the Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson, the Trail of Tears, and a lot of us, if not all of us, upon learning about these events for the first time, tend to be very upset about this harsh reality that we have to face of historical magnitude. It's hard to process in a lot of instances the ability to be wrong and still learn from that and move forward. So in a lot of instances, when we teach or learn about the concept of the Indian Removal Act, we tend to become very passionate about the injustice, if you will. How dare this happen to this group of people? Why is this not communicated more? Why has history somewhat covered this up? When we first discover things like this, we tend to ask a lot of questions, and there tends to be a lot of natural emotion behind it as well. It's a human condition. The question, though, that I would ask is what happens when we instill all those emotions and then at the same time we are so adamant about this is wrong, I can't believe this happened, et cetera, but then someone takes the rug that you're standing on and pulls it out from underneath you. And then you realize your world is upside down and you don't know what is right and what is wrong. At the moment, there is this passion of sadness towards the Native American nations, right? The 5 specific nations from the Indian Removal Act, along with other nations as well. However, we need to throw a wrench into this system a little bit. We need to upset the fruit basket a little bit. We need to disrupt our thought process. Because I would like to challenge you with this idea. Could we say what Jackson did in relation to the Indian Removal Act? Is it tragic? Yes. Could it have been prevented? Absolutely. Inhumane? You bet. I think we could all agree to that. But there's a group of people we're not really talking about in all of this as well. Remember, this happens in the 1800s. That means in the United States, there are multiple groups of people, and make no mistake, this is before the Civil War takes place as well, meaning slavery is still alive and well inside the United States. What makes that even more difficult to comprehend is in this instance, when we're talking about slavery, we're not talking about the standard American story of the white plantation owner with the black slaves. No, we're talking about the Native Americans and the slaves that they owned. Did that just change your perspective a little bit? Believe it or not, historically, we'll focus once again on the Cherokee Nation. As the Cherokee Nation came to fruition or came to existence, they began to adopt several different codes, several different ideas and concepts from the Europeans that were traveling into the United States, Eurocentric, the white Americans. One of those things was that they did adopt the concept of slavery. Slaves were used inside the Cherokee Nation, whether it be for agricultural purposes, whether it be for household duties. Slavery was a thing. Slave trading took place. These are all real things. In fact, when the Cherokee Nation, along with the others, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and other groups, as they began their Trail of Tears march, were always saddened by the tragedy of having to walk thousands of miles, but they weren't the only ones that were marching forward as well. They took their slaves with them, which becomes a very fascinating episode years later, because a lot of these Native American nations we know wind up in what's present day known as Oklahoma. That's interesting to us because by 1921, really the roaring 20s, so well in advance past this class, we're going to find out that Tulsa, Oklahoma is one of the central hubs for economic development and success of Black Americans. In fact, it becomes named Black Wall Street, just like the Wall Street you think of today. Now, there's tragedies associated with that take place later in 1921. But one of the questions that we're constantly considering is, why Tulsa, Oklahoma? Well, it's because the heritage. It's because of the people who traveled to Oklahoma years and years prior. As they settled, as they became free, they started to develop their own identity, their own culture. And part of that is Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is very fascinating to today. The whole premise behind this is to recognize that from a humanitarian aspect, it's easy for us to look at one group oppressing the other group and say, how dare you? I am so sorry. It's an innate reaction for us. We find sadness and pity and other emotions associated with it. But sometimes when that happens, we forget those that we feel bad for, those who have had injustices committed against them. Sometimes we forget that in a lot of instances, they too can be just as guilty for acts that they have conducted. Sometimes it's like we put on blinders and we're oblivious to the faults going on around us. Or when we have that crush that we see in middle school and high school, many can relate to, we see all their perfections. We really miss all the little things that are just like, you're still a human and you're still kind of weird. We miss those. Like, we're blind to it, right? History is not kind because we tend to be blind in history. We tend to focus on the winners. We tend to forget about the losers. And we tend to think that once we find those who have had injustice done to them, we need to pick them up, brush them off, and say, I'm so sorry, and ignore the fact that they too have their own skeletons in their closet. So as we continue to investigate into westward expansion, and we start to really see this identity of America, understand that it's very simple, very easy, almost expected of us to see this hotly contested debate of white and black inside the United States, especially in the realm of slavery in this time period in the 1800s, because it's going to boil up to a head that we call the Civil War later on. But don't forget, when we also look at things like the Trail of Tears and the events that take place, those people groups are going to come up again. In fact, a lot of those nations wind up fighting for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Does your perspective of the Native Americans after the Trail of Tears change? Do you have different emotions towards them knowing more of the story? It shows us that as historians, it's so vital to really pick apart every little detail to get the full picture. One puzzle piece doesn't tell us what everything is. A lot of instances, we have to put all 1,000 pieces together to really see the full image. History is the same way. We can't just afford to look at one picture or one image or one little piece. We have to put them all together to get this mosaic, to get this full imagery of really what history is trying to tell us. So, challenge yourself. Has your perspective changed? Do you see people groups in different lights now that you know of some of the misfortunes that have taken place through history? Something to consider.